Thank you for joining. This is Tarot in White Oracle, where we get into the cloud to see what we see. This is our learning center, and all these will be for free. This is going to be playlist 3 for this video, but feel free to jump right in, if you feel comfortable wanting to learn this, or you can watch some of the previous videos. The knowledge does build upon each other. So this is about the Urim and Thummim, and we're going to talk about how this is related to our tarot, because as I was studying it, I was putting a lot of different links together, which were very interesting, and I wanted to share with other curious minds. So of course we have Exodus chapter 28 and verse 6 talks about the vest of gold and blue, purple, scarlet yarn. Take 2 onyx stones, engrave them with the names of Israel. So I have here our mock vest with our gold yarn and our blue and purple and scarlet yarn, and I have our 2 onyx stones here, which you can see is all going to be paper, of course. And we've got Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Dan, which was replaced by the Manasseh, Naphtali, the Gad, Asher, and Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. And of course we have the Ephraim, his other son, which was added later, of course, if you want to take out the Levi. So there were 12, and it would be on the shoulder of the priest. And the priest would be wearing a vest with the yarn. Now, on the yarn, of course, is our next page. So you might want to go to Exodus, same chapter, but like verse 12. Put the 2 stones on the shoulder pieces of the vest, so that's there. And then make a breastplate for judging and have it crafted by skilled artisans. Of course, they go into the descriptions, and put on it the setting of stones. So there's going to be 4 rows of stones, 3 stones each. And of course, on these stones, you'll correspond the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're to be engraved with their names as a seal would be engraved to represent the 12 tribes. So you can read a little bit more on that if you want. We also have descriptions in Ezra 2:63, Nehemiah 7:65. Of course, it's mentioned in the Talmud, and of course, it is also mentioned in the Qumran. The Psalms scroll talk about divine illumination, and Qumran Psalms 4:6, 23, 18, 29. So that's chapter 4, verse 6, and chapter 18, 29, and chapter 23. A divine illumination, that's what we're going to get into, that causes their message to be lucid and carried out. That's in the Talmud, the Yoma 73b. It's also mentioned in the Josephus 3, chapter 3, verse 2:17. It states, victory was forecast by the shining of stones in the breastplate. And of course, we'll get a little bit farther into different descriptions and what different things mean. But so you have 4 rows, you've got 3 jewels. Now, the first one was the tribe of Reuben, or carnelian stone. So this is going to be the carnelian. Now, obviously, these are not the actual stones, just trying to show you an example. The second was Simon, and it was made of a gold topaz. So I have colored pencils underneath here to help you understand the stones. The third was Levi, and that was emerald. Now, of course, Levi was replaced with Ephraim later. Then we have Judah, which was green feldspar, and we've got the color here. We've got the tribe of Dan, sapphire, blue sapphire, that was later replaced by the Manasseh tribe. And then we have Naphtali, which was white diamond. And then we have Gad, which was orange zircon. And then the next one in the row would be Asher, the tribe of Asher, and that was by blue agate. And then we have Issachar, and that was amethyst. Now, in our last row, we had Zebulun, the tribe of Zebulun. This was represented by the jewel beryl. And then we had the tribe of Josephus, which was represented by onyx. Now, we also had 2 onyx up here stones, which would be on the shoulders of the person. And lastly, we had Benjamin, which was red jasper. So these were the stones, and obviously they would have a back side to it and a front side. And this would lay on top, the 2 stones with the names, and this would lay over the person's heart. So we're going to go a little bit more in depth of what all this means. So a lot of people say that this was simply taking 2 stones, that the Urim and Thummim was like casting lots or claromancy or cardmancy, and one stone would say yes, the other one would say no, one would say innocent, the other guilty, and then they would roll it and then they would see. Now that's one argument that's made. I personally don't think that that's what it is. That also is not what the rabbis, the ancient rabbis, say that it is, or it's not even described that way in the Talmud either. So basically, what is it? What is the Urim and Thummim? Now, Churchill is quoted as saying that it's like a riddle inside of a mystery, inside of an enigma. Like, no one can figure it out. So let's go ahead and get a little bit more information about what did the Talmud say? What did the rabbis say? All right, so when we dive further into this, so some of the thoughts from the, ancient rabbis and the Talmud and so forth. Of course, I mentioned the Qumran. It does talk about divine illumination. Now, Urim is light. Thummim is the perfection of, or the perfection of truth. So it's like something is lit up. Now, in the Hebrew, the perfection of the truth, in order for that to take place, action would have to take place. So it's interpreted that something is lit up and then action is taking place to perfect that truth. Now, when we look at, say, the Talmud, there is also relevance to the oracle is being spelt out by miraculous protruding of letters. There's a reference to this. The Rashi in Yoma 73a, I think it is, it talks about the Urim, which was the light, was a tetragrammation inside of a breastplate. And the Thummim was the perfection of the oracle. So the Urim and Thummim, so the Urim would be a light. So it does talk about, so the next scripture, when you look in, your Exodus 28, and it takes you all the way down to past verse 23, past verse 22, 24, and we're down to 30. You are to put the Urim and Thummim in the breastplate for judging. Some people say Urim and Thummim in the breastplate for judging. So the Urim is the light and the Thummim is the perfection of truth. You figure if those two, whatever they were, now it's a mystery of what exactly were they? Were they stones? Now there is reference to them being the Urim alabaster, the Thummim hematite. But there's also the idea that perhaps they were the names of God or something else. Anyhow, they are put underneath the breastplate and they light up. So it will light up behind these jewels. And on each jewel is the name of the tribe of Israel. So we're going to go in a little bit more into that because it gets a lot more interesting as we get deeper. But the Nachmanides says the Urim was a text with divine names, and various letters of tribes of names would light up. So this is a common idea within the ancient rabbi thinking of what this actually was. And so a question would be asked, and when a question was asked, a light would shine underneath a couple of the names, and that would be a letter indicating what the meaning of the answer was. Now, so there's also a reference in Hosea chapter 3 verse 4 as well. So these are some references you might want to go to: Exodus 28, 30, 39, 21, 1 Samuel 14, 41, the Yoma in the Talmud 73a. And so it's all really fascinating because the Hebrews had 4 different ways of divination, right? There was the Urim and Thummim, which for many people is a mystery, but I'm going to go in deeper as to how I see it connecting to tarot. And of course, there were dreams, they were prophets, and they were seers. So these were the 4 main ways that the Hebrews had divination. So how did they use this then, and how does it relate to tarot? So you know by watching my previous videos that each arcana card is related to a Hebrew letter, which in turn is related to an Egyptian glyph, which it evolved from linguistically. And so when we look at this arcana card, for example, this is Lamed in the Hebrew. And so we have the card in arcana that looks like this. And in the Hebrew, the Lamed is a symbol like this, and it means justice, mediator, balancing, resolving conflicts, legation, laws, labor, the shepherd's crook. Now in Egypt, you can take it back to the shepherd's crook, which was control of the flock, balancing between the flock on one side and the other side, so they don't eat too much of the grass on one side. You got to put them on the other side to make sure it's even and balanced. There's also an idea of Sphinx, or the lion, which guards the horizon. So these were some Egyptian understandings and glyphs, which then the Lamed came out of the Hebrew. And so it originally looked like this in Egypt, and then it became like this in Hebrew. Now, you're going to have to watch the other videos if you don't understand how the Hebrew then correlates to the arcana. Of course, there's criticisms both ways, that no, the cards aren't related at all. I would argue that they, of course, are. Whether it was purposefully for divination or if it was just someone who was very inspired by the Hebrew letters, to me, it makes no sense that it would be a complete accident. But anyway, on this, we're just going to be given the notion that each of these arcana are related to each of the 22 Hebrew letters. Now, when we look at justice, we get, the Lamed, and this relates to Levi. So the Levi tribe would be L. That would be the letter that's being used. Now, I think that the ancient rabbis have an idea that these were letters, and letters would come together and spell words, because that's how we understood things 500 years ago when they were writing their interpretations. That's how we understand things now. Letters don't have meaning. But when this was put together, this was like 3,000 years ago. And when this was put together, the letters were being evolved out of Egypt at the time frame was very close. And so you're not going to lose the meaning of the Hebrew letters just like that. You've got the shepherd's crook out of Egypt. You know that it has a social understanding, a cultural understanding of balancing, evening things out, making sure, the sheep are being taken care of and they're on each side. There's a sense of evenness and balance, mediation. And when the Hebrew letter evolved out of that, obviously it retained a lot of that understanding because it has a strong indication of mediator, balancing, resolving conflicts, legation, and laws. And of course, that's what our justice means as well, our justice card. Even the original card that was formed, which you can see on another website, the cards from the 1450s, is justice and she's carrying the balance scale. So in the 1450s, when the card was designed, the intention was with the sense of that idea. So this is, of course, the first letter for Levi. And so I don't think that it actually spelt out letters to form words. I think that each of these jewels represented a letter, and each of these letters maintained the metaphorical and spiritual understanding, and also concrete and abstract understanding that that letter was. Because at that time, that meaning wasn't just thrown out the window. To me, that makes absolutely no sense. So this obviously meant justice, that letter. And when it didn't just mean Lamed, it didn't just mean L, it meant what that letter evolved out of from the Egypt, from the Hebrew, right when it became a Hebrew letter. When we look at, say, Reuben, this is our Resh card. It's related to our Resh. Now, the Resh has a strong understanding of what our Sun card in Arcana means as well. And when we look at Simon, we've got Sheen, and Sheen has a strong understanding of our Judgment card. They mean the similar thing, just like with Justice. Each of these cards evolved out of the Hebrew, which evolved out of the Egypt. And you can say that each letter doesn't have any meaning anymore, but I just don't think that that's true. That's true, from 500 years ago. That's true maybe even 1,000 years ago, but that wasn't true 3,000 years ago. And you can look at many of the Old Testament words when they were written in the time frame of 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, and they make perfect sense when you use arcana, pictograms, to understand the word instead of the letter. You can see clearly how it evolved that way. Now, later in time, of course, the meaning of letters started to be disassociated, and slowly it was just letters, and more words needed to be formed. And how do we form these new words? Oh, let's put these letters together, and they didn't retain the meaning as they did originally. But they didn't invent a whole new vocabulary that was already there. I mean, there was already a base there. So I don't agree with that mindset. That makes absolutely no sense with the way language and culture works. But so then when you go to our next category, we've got Judah, and that of course is related to our Hermit card. And then we have Dan, and of course this is related to our Empress card, because this is Dalet, and this is Yod for Judah. Now we have Nephatili, this is Nun, or our Death and Rebirth card. And then we've got Gad, which is Gamel, or our High Priestess card. And then we have Asher, which is Aleph, or our Fool card. And then we have Isher, which is a repetition of, Issachar, which is a repetition of the Hermit. And then we've got Zebulun, which is our Lover's card, because this is Zayin. And then we have Joseph, which is a repetition of Yod. And then we have Benjamin, which is Bet, or the Magician. So essentially what they had on their breastplate, I don't believe that the priests at that time were only looking at letters. That's how we do things in modern day. So the disassociation between letters and meaning, of course, occurs over time. But in that time period, I think that their letters retained meaning. And so they didn't have to have letters come in a certain order, like to make sense for them to form a word. What they were forming was pictures of meaning, which is what we do in tarot. So for example, a light might have shone behind Sun, and then Aleph, and then Magician. It wouldn't form a word, it would form an understanding of meaning that comes together. Now, if the light shone behind the Fool first, and then Sun, and then Magician, maybe they would say, oh, this makes no sense because these letters coming together doesn't form a word. but it's not supposed to form a word. It's supposed to form a pictogram of meaning. And so now it still retains meaning. It retains meaning because this has a meaning that means something differently when you put it in reverse order. Or say a light shone behind Nun, and then Gimel, and then Zayin. Now, if the lights shone differently, that would be a completely different meaning. It wouldn't have to form a word. It would just have to form a picture meaning. And so these lights would be shining behind this. Now, you could argue they were maybe in front of a window, they were outside, the sun would shine on certain time periods, and depending on when this occurs, it may be shining down, in different orders. And you could say, okay, maybe it was just that. But also I would say, of course, there's magic behind it. God is directing it in a certain way. And this is why certain things shined at a certain time. Now, the priest did have to have the Ruach HaKodesh, which is the Holy Spirit, to be able to interpret the language, to be able to interpret the meaning. Because when you don't have the intuition connected to source, connected to God or Holy Spirit, you could say, what you're doing when you do tarot is a very similar process to what this Urim and Thummim to me looks a lot like. If you are shuffling, and upon shuffling, you shuffle out a couple cards. Of course, you can argue this is random, just like you can argue, oh, the sun is shining and it's just the sun. And that's what happens. And all these mathematical principles take place. And of course, it's generalized. And so there's a certain amount of people who can understand and relate. But there's also an intuitive aspect to it. There is a spirit quality to it. And when you are in the spirit, when you are in the intuition, when you're connected to source, to God, you're able to see what the meaning is. And yeah, there are mathematical principles guiding things. For sure, there are natural principles guiding things. But when you work that in conjunction with spirit, intuition, source, then you're able to understand what's being said. And so to me, that's what tarot is. To me, they were just practicing tarot. So I find that's very, very fascinating. And now the next question, of course, would be, did they incorporate all their letters or did they not incorporate all their letters? Because there's only 10. Now, even though they have 12, there's only 10 of the letters that are actually used. So let's go ahead and put these down first. So there's Lamed, and of course we have Resh, we have Yod, we have Gimel, we have Zayin, we have Bet, we have Dalet, and we have Aleph. So how did they get the other letters? Because we have 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and we have 22 arcana cards which relate to each one. So some of the rabbis would argue that it wasn't just the 12 tribes that were on, but there was also a message above that said the 12 tribes of Israel and the 3 major patriarchs would be included, Abraham, Moses, and Jacob. And that would include then all of the letters. I'm not really sure if I agree with that, just because that's not what it says in the Bible. It just says that there were the 12 tribes. Now, there is another argument that I found, which I agree with more so, which is that within each of these letters, say Resh, you spell Resh using other letters. So you don't just have the Resh now, right? You have Resh, you have Sheen, and you have Ha. And then you've spelled Resh. So now you've actually got 3 letters composed here, not just one. So this would actually look like this. These letters would be on that jewel. To me, this makes a lot more sense because you're simply spelling out each of the letters, which is what it says. If you look at the Torah or the Bible, it says basically that each of the letters were engraved on the stone, or each tribe of Israel was engraved on the stone. So for example, Reuben, of course, is the Resh, and so we went over R, and then of course the S, the Sheen, and the H. And so the first jewel would have these letters, or these arcana understandings for each letter on it. But of course you spell Reuben with more letters, and you've got a B in there as well, right? So you'd also have Bet, B, and then Tet, which is our strength card. So that would be here. So we would have also the magician and strength incorporated in there as well. So these letters, or these pictograms, you could call them, would be all in the first jewel. So if you do that for each letter, of course, you get all of the letters from the Hebrew alphabet, because now you've got Simon, which is Sheen, which is, of course, the S and the Nun, and then you have the M, which is Mem. And so now we're looking at our Hangman card as well being included, or Mem. And then we've got N, which is Nun again. So as you go down the list, there's more and more letters that are incorporated. So this is an example. Say you might have 4 or 6 Hebrew letters or arcana cards in each jewel. And so as the jewel lit up, or as the shine from the sun went behind it, you would then be able to see different letters which had different arcana meaning light up in different orders. Now, yeah, so I personally don't think that it was about letters matching up to form a word. I think it was about meaning, picture meanings, which were understood through each letter, matching up in different variations. And of course, you can watch the next vid to kind of see how different Hebrew words are formed by arcana. Now, with the understanding that throughout time, as you know, we get to, so this was practice, the Urim and Thummim was practice, you know, about 500 years before Christ was born. So it was practiced for about 1,000+ years before then. And when the second temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, of course, everything was gone. They didn't know which priests were from the Levite tribe. They didn't have the Urim and Thummim, maybe. And so it supposedly ended 500 years before Christ was born. However, there are arguments that, and I think Josephus says that the Urim and Thummim actually were in the temple still. It's just they didn't possess its magic anymore, or they just didn't use it anymore. But a side note, so this is one way, or that it's a possibility as to how all the letters were incorporated. Another argument is that it is the 12 tribes of Israel, and the patriarchs were listed above as well, and this incorporates all the letters. Now, if you only look at what each tribe letter was, so the first letter in Reuben, the first letter in Simon, and so on, you are missing 4 of the under letters altogether. So which 4 are you actually missing if you're only incorporating the names? Now, because Reuben has a B and an N, this actually is also an S, and this is also a B, and this is also an N. So there's more than just the first letter that can be used for each name, but I'm only using the first letter as a representation. So when you do that, you get 18 letters. So it still doesn't get down to 22. So that's why the argument is that each of these letters were actually spelt out, because it wasn't just the name that was spelt or the first letter. It was actually each letter that was spelt out. And that allows all the letters. But if you only look at the name, which is what the Bible or Torah specifically says, write the tribe of Israel on each one, the name. It doesn't really say write each of those letters out. But if you do that, to the T, word for word, without any other interpretation, you're missing 4 letters. So what are those 4 letters that you're missing? I don't want to go through each one of these right now, maybe in another video, but many of these other Arcana cards can be placed on top. So what do we get to? We get to our Tet, Kof, Zadi, and Ket, or Chet, however you want to pronounce it. So Chet was often about sin, missing the mark. And of course, Chet and Tet together was like a sin inside of you. Tet was like that goodness inside of you. So it's like the sin inside of you. And so that was understood to mean, see, none of us tribes have sin in us, because these 2 letters aren't being used. The other 2 letters that are not used is Kof and Zadi, or moon and the star card. So this is Chariot and the Strength card. And so this has to do with the end of days, or the end of time. So that's Zadi and the moon. So in Arcana, that would be these 2 cards together. That would mean the end of days, the end of time. That's one interpretation anyway. And of course, Chet with strength, one interpretation was the sin inside of you. Now, we know with our Arcana, there are multiple understandings for each card, and depending on if it comes out in past, present, future, on its side, reverse, and the context around it can give you a different understanding. So, but when you look at the original breastplate in Exodus, what you have is these 4 letters missing: Kof, Zadi, Chet, or Ket, and Tet, or moon, star, chariot, and strength. Those 4 were possibly not included. Now, of course, the argument is that they were spelt out, each letter, and so by doing that, you incorporate all of them, or the patriarchs were put on. But who knows if that was actually true? Maybe they didn't actually incorporate those 4 letters. Maybe, the star and the moon and the Tet and the chariot, maybe they just weren't included in their form of tarot. Because in essence, this is tarot. That's what this is. This is getting a letter, another letter to form a word, or getting a letter and another letter that has meaning to come together to form a bigger meaning, to understand an answer to something. And that's essentially what we do with taroting. We have all of these meanings, which also represent letters, that are shuffled, that come out to show us a meaning, an answer to something. So I just think that that is very fascinating. And so the other thing I just wanted to quickly mention as well was, in Babylonia, they did have something called Urtu and Tumitu. Now, Urtu meant oracle, and Tumitu meant command. So there was something similar that they had. Now, it involved a sheep and killing it and reading the entrails, and you don't want to do that. But it is interesting that they had a similar verbiage. Now, It's hard to say, though. Some people say that the Hebrew culture got their Urim and Thummim from the Babylonians. You could say, no, the Babylonians got it from them. It's also possible, I haven't seen much argument on it, but I think it's quite possible that both of them were influenced by Egypt. And the reason I say that is just because the language from the Hebrew language, obviously it evolved out of Egypt, and from there it moves to Greece, and it moves to Rome, and then it moves, into Latin and our English. Aleph bet is alpha bet. So that's where language came from. It came from Egypt. That's how everyone has their language today. And Egypt had 500 hieroglyphs originally, which then became 5,000. And they had about 2,000 deities, which I would call angels or characteristics of events in life. And, for our modern day context of understanding. And, it begs the question, why did only 22 of those hieroglyphs make it to Hebrew? And I personally feel that it's because when you have a language and you have a culture, that language that Egypt has evolved out of Egypt into Hebrew, and it brings with it all of its meaning, right? It brings with it all of its culture, all of its social things. You can't just completely cut off all that. That's just not how language and culture work. I know there's an argument that no, the letters were taken and then it was just the letters and there was no meaning associated with. I find that very difficult to believe, just because when you are in a culture and you're so close by, if you're going to be borrowing language, you're going to be borrowing. Language is intricately woven with culture. You can't separate those two completely. That's just, and then you're going to have to completely start a whole new vocabulary for your culture. And so you're just going to throw out every word that you've had before that means every single item around you. And you're just going to completely make up a whole new vocabulary. And then have a bunch of random letters with random sounds be put together to form a whole new, that doesn't make any sense. That's just not true. That's not how these things work. So of course meaning was brought with it. Of course cultural and social understanding was brought with it. And so when this takes place, why do those 22 letters survive? They survive because those were the important, sacred letters in Egypt. They were the most sacred. What makes them the most important? What makes them the most sacred? The deities. And when you have something that's so important, you're going to retain that. You're going to hold on to it. You don't want to lose that. That is considered the most significant of your information, right? So I think that those 22 letters came out of Egypt because those were the most sacred. They were the ones that were the most related to a deity or an angel or a life event that was the most significant, that happened to most people, were most significant events for society. And it helped you to define the world that you lived in with just those meanings. You didn't need all these other meanings because the other meanings were minor, right? So I think that's why those 22 letters survived out of Egypt. And I might do a video on how they are linked to a significant Egyptian god. I know that Resh comes from Ra, which is the Egyptian sun god, which was one of their primary gods. They also had a moon god, and they also had the combination of the sun and the moon together to make a new, most powerful god. So I do know that the sun card comes from Resh out of Hebrew, which comes from Ra out of Egypt. And so I know that this one was retained because this was a major god. And it, meaning that it held a significant metaphorical, spiritual, abstract, and concrete understanding of life, how they defined life, and its significance in the way events took place in their culture and in today, right? So yeah, I'd be willing to bet that all the other major arcana are linked to a very significant god, but that's another video. In terms of it, and I bring all this up because this links us back to the Urtu and Tumitu, and it links us back to the Urim and Thummim, which came first. Well, I think it's quite possible that they all came out of Egypt because the language came out of Egypt. And when you have language, you have culture, you have social memory. And so these things come together. And so I also came across some documents out of 100 BCE, which was about the Greco-Egyptian magic divination. And so out of Egypt, they would take palm leaves. They had 29 though. And they would write a letter. So for our purposes, I'll just say A to Z, A, B, C, D. Under each letter, they would write the name of a deity. Now, the letters they were using were Coptic, which meant the Egyptian glyph, which evolved into the Hebrew, which then became a Greek letter, came back around to Egypt. And that was called Coptic. But essentially it just came out of Egypt and it just came back to Egypt. And so now they're writing the Coptic letter. Now, I would argue that the Coptic letters were retaining meaning to the Egyptians at least, because they would know that A was Aleph, which was our understanding of a new beginning, leaping out into the unknown, having a leap of faith, the representation of all of mankind. Their glyph was the ox head, which was also dominion and power over, an example of all of mankind as well, having a dominion over. And they also had the understanding of unity and oneness and wholeness with that ox head. I guess you can also say they had a falcon. Some of the research shows they had a symbol of a falcon, which was a kingship, fierce, fast, celestial power of flight to take off. And that's our full card. So basically, they would write, say, that letter A, which they knew was Aleph, which they knew was the ox head, and they knew it had that meaning. That would be my argument. I would highly doubt they didn't understand that. And then underneath that letter, they would write a deity name. Now, my bet would be that deity name is probably a deity that symbolized our full card. That meaning that I just, spoke about, which was all the meaning from falcon and ox head. So I am going to do another video to see how each one of these link to a deity, or aka an angel, or aka a life event. Because of course way back then they called every life event a deity, right? Death was a deity, life was a deity, everything was a deity. They had like 2,000. So basically they would write the letter, then underneath that they would write the deity or the life event, which to me that would be like writing A and then writing the name of their god, which represented their ox head, their falcon, the wholeness of humanity, unity, oneness, power and domain, flight, taking off into a leap of faith, all those things. That meaning is what that deity was. And then they would take another letter, they'd say B, which they would know was Bet, which they would know came from their word or their glyph for house, which was the ability to put things into it. You can put all your material possessions into a house now, into something. You can consider your house a cave, you could consider it the earth, but you're able to put all of your material possessions in that house. You're manifesting material things. You can also hide and conceal your material things in your house. Your house provides you your manifestation and concealing power, which is also understanding in the Hebrew letter as well. But so they would write B, which they knew was Bet, which they knew was their symbol for house, I'm sure. And then they would write a deity underneath it. And that deity would represent, most likely, the magician card, I'm sure. Again, I'll do a video on each of these because I can see how all these are linked. And then they would take another C, and then they would write, or G, and then they'd write, they would know that that was Gemel, which they knew was related to their ancient symbol of a vase or vase, which basically was a conduit or a channel or a throat of a camel, which was essentially where water would go from one place. It would channel, or a conduit, which is what our high priestess is. She's a channel, she's a conduit from what? Water, which is our symbol of emotion, intuition, from the higher realms to the lower realms. And so they would have, G, and then they'd write that deity, which I'm sure was a representation of our Gemel card. So they would take all of these palm leaves and then they would throw them on the ground. They'd shuffle them up and throw them on the ground. How is that not tarot? And then they would take two, put it to the side, take two, put it to the side, until they had one left, and then they'd lift it up and look at it, and they'd read it, and that would be the answer to their question. What were the Egyptians doing that was tarot? They were finding leaves, which were just like cards per se, writing a letter on it, and underneath would be the meaning. What were the Hebrews doing? They had a breastplate, and on the breastplate, they would have each of the Hebrew letters on it, just like Egyptians would write letters on theirs. And underneath that, of course, you could say, which I would argue, they actually understood a meaning to each letter. Now, they wouldn't be writing the deity name, but it would be the meaning, which is what, to the Egyptians, that deity meant anyway. And that meaning then would be held in each of the letters. And as lights lit up, which of course is far more, magical or mystical or interesting than, throwing the leaves down or having cards shuffled out. But it would then show you different letters or different meanings, and that would give you an answer to the question. I mean, that's essentially tarot. I mean, if you take all the cards, though, you can say that, it's accidental. You can say that, you could have all these mathematical and natural principles that you can apply to it, of course. But for people that are spiritual and understand the spiritual side of things, you would understand that, okay, this is my question, this is my intention, and this is the answer. And by using your, Ruach HaKodesh, or your Holy Spirit, or your intuition, or your connection to Source God, you're able to understand better what the answer to that question was. So, I mean, essentially, Arcana is a sacred language. The tarot is a sacred language. And I would argue that the Urim and Thummim was a sophisticated form of the tarot that the Hebrews practiced. And it definitely was a form that the Greco-Egyptians practiced. And I would also argue that the Egyptians practiced it thousands of years before that evidence from 100 BCE, because that's just the evidence we have. It doesn't mean that that's all there is. And so the fact that they were writing, they had pictures of Egyptian gods and writing Egyptian god names down there, tells me that this was more of an Egyptian practice than a Greek practice. And that they most likely had things similar that they practiced 500,000 of years before that known practice that we know. But if you have more information, I'd love to hear comments from you and dive deeper into it. You can jump onto our part 2 of the Urim and Thummim compilation. I know this one was super long, but I wanted to get as much in as I could. And the next one goes into a lot of the words, the old words put together, Hebrew words from 3,000 years ago, and how they when we look at it in picture form, how it makes so much sense. We'll go into each of the tribes of Israel and spell it out in Arcana, which is pretty cool as well, because I can see clearly that they're all linked, Egypt and Hebrew and Arcana, and also possibly Babylonia. Maybe they learned it from the Egyptians or from the Hebrews, and they started practicing Urtu and Tumitu. Or maybe maybe the Hebrews and Babylonians independently started practicing it out of some Egyptian practices that they learned about. But it is rather interesting. All right. Thank you so much for joining, and I will see you guys later.